Good evening. So this is the kaleidoscope of my work. It begins when I get up in the morning and I open the fridge and I see the nutritional information label and it tells me about fat and it tells me about salt, and then there's a best before date. And that's before I got the kitchen, and then it follows me to work where I see a sign that tells me that I need to be careful of crime, or that I need to watch out for floods, or a sign that tells me that I've got to watch out for swooping birds, which is a new one, or perhaps watch out for crocodiles if I'm somewhere a bit more exotic, like Australia. My research is about how people, you, I, others, people in different countries, understand and communicate about risks. And we use the tools of social science to try to get a clearer picture of what people think, for a start, and then how what they think motivates their decisions. The idea of all this, we hope, is to be able to devise and design tools and interventions that help people to make better decisions in the face of risk. And we're interested in individual decisions, certainly, but perhaps even more so, we're interested in collective decisions, how groups, communities, societies take decisions about risk. And if they're to do that well, then they're going to have to talk about it. And that's the focus of this talk this evening. But before we leap into that, it's probably a good idea to have a definition, a common understanding of what we see risk as, because in everyday conversation, we use risk in lots of different ways, sometimes in the same sentence, or at least the same paragraph. Sometimes we use risk to talk about the hazard, the source of the risk. We say nuclear power risk. Sometimes we use it to talk about probability. We say the risk of falling, or the risk of an accident. And sometimes we use it closer to harm. We say a community at risk. But for our purposes this evening, I want to focus on two central aspects of risk. The first is the possibility of harm, and the second is uncertainty. So risk isn't the same as catastrophe. That's a disaster that's already happened. And nor is risk the same as opportunity, when what we mean by that is picking between two options, we're not quite sure which one is the best. It's the possibility of harm that makes decisions about risk important. And it's uncertainty that makes them particularly difficult. Now, usually when we're taking a decision, we would go and find more information, and more information would help us to take a better decision. But one of the curious things about uncertainty is that we're often actually worse at taking the decision when we have more information, in the sense of making a judgment about something that's actually already happened. Think about what happens when there's a train crash. Everybody immediately starts to theorize and to investigate.
The cause of the crash was. Everybody's looking for somebody, an institution, perhaps an individual, to blame for it. When it might well be the case that it's simply the confluence of a series of very unlikely and very unfortunate events that led to that crash. What about the owner of this house? What do you think they might be thinking? Every other house in their neighborhood has been knocked out by a hurricane. Maybe they're thinking to themselves, we're luckier than others. Maybe they're thinking to themselves, our house was built of better materials, or perhaps it was built in a better spot. Or perhaps they were just very lucky this time, and next time they won't be quite so lucky. This is what's known as hindsight bias. And it turns out that it's a very common way for us to think. What about somebody who says, I don't need to wear a seatbelt while I'm driving because I've been driving for 30 years, I've never had an accident, I'm safe. But the crucial point is that the probability of having an accident the next time they go out is entirely independent of the fact that they've driven for 30 years without one. Hindsight bias, something to watch out for. So it seems if we're going to have a good conversation about risk, we're going to need to have a very good idea of what the probability of a particular event happening is. So we go online, we look up some data, we do some analysis, and that's it, right? Not so easy. Let me introduce you to my mother. My mother is an indestructible English woman. I can barely remember a day in my life when she stayed in bed. If she feels sick, she has a cup of tea, gets an early night, and wakes up right as rain in the morning. So when it came to COVID, she didn't really see why she should wear a mask. Now, of course, as a daughter, I wanted her to do everything possible to protect herself. And as an academic, I thought, I'll throw some data her way and that will convince her. So I showed her graphs like this one. And the message of the graph is terrifyingly clear. The chances of having a serious case of COVID and even of dying were much, much higher for older people than they were for younger. In fact, somebody who was 80 is 500 more times more likely to die than somebody who's 20. But my mother said, I'm healthier than other people my age, and I've got a very good immune system. That may be. But the problem with that line of reasoning, that problem of seeing yourself as not part of the average, is that there were two things we knew about COVID at that stage that explained why people were more likely to die. And one of them was an underlying condition, and the other one was their age. And that figure for how many people were dying in their 80s includes the 50% of people who are healthier than average for their age. We might call this a self-exceptionalism bias, this difficulty of thinking of yourself as part of the average. And one of my favorite examples of this is that 73% of American drivers think they are a better driver than average. 80% of male American drivers think they are. Now, we know that 75% of people cannot be above average. And yet, it does tend to be very difficult for us to think of ourselves as being part of the population that the average applies to. But sometimes we are not part of that average, and that can be a considerable source of stress, as I will explain now. When I was pregnant with my son, I was living in China. And I was going along for my 6-month, that 24-week scan. And that's a big one. That they test you for everything under the sun, every possible measurement they can take, they do take. And then you expect to get some important news at the end of it about the development of the baby. And of course, you're crossing all your fingers and toes that everything is all right. So we went through all these tests, and then my husband and I went back into the doctor's office in order to hear the interpretation, to hear the results. Our nerves were not calmed by seeing her frowning, head in her papers, shuffling them, and scribbling like mad with a pen. And next to her was the nurse who was there to help if there were any translation issues between English and Chinese. And the doctor spoke, not looking up, very quickly, in Chinese. And then the nurse looked at us apologetically and said, "The doctor says that the baby's skull is not developing properly." That's not what you want to hear. I mean, there are a lot of things you don't want to hear at that particular appointment, but that is not one of them. If the skull's not developing properly, then the brain is not developing properly, and we held our breath. The doctor went back to her papers, and she said, the width of the baby's skull is more than 1 standard deviation below the average. The length is normal, but the width is below the average, and we're very concerned about this. And finally, she looked up. She held my gaze for a moment. And then her face softened a little. She looked at me and she said, but your face is so narrow. So it turns out that my face shape was not within the one standard deviation of the average in her data set, nor was the baby, and the baby also was outside it. Well, it turned out that it wasn't a defect in the baby, who turned out to grow up very normally and happily. It was a case of a mistaken average. That's a lot of stress over statistics. We've talked so far about some of the biases or the mental shortcuts that can cause disagreements or miscommunications when it comes to risk. Now I want to think about something deeper, something more foundational that can affect our views. And that's our values. Some of my friends are humanitarian workers. Almost by definition, they work in some of the most insecure places in the world. In my view, and quite likely in yours too, they also do some of the most important and valuable work in the world. And there's no doubt about the fact that being a humanitarian worker is dangerous. You've got some statistics up here from 2022 on how many serious incidents there were. So there were attacks, there were kidnappings, and there were 108 killings of humanitarian workers, and 2022 was a fairly good year. Well, is it the case that aid workers don't know this data? Is it the case that they've seen it, but they're applying this self-exceptionalism and they're saying it doesn't apply to me? No. They know this better than anyone. But what they say, and I'll borrow their words directly here, is that if the need is huge, then am I willing to accept the risk changes? This beautiful wild place is on the west coast of Greenland. It's called Uummannaq. It's at very, very high risk of a tsunami. It's located in an area which is geologically unstable. And seismologists and geologists have studied it carefully, and there's a high risk of a landslide which will go into the bay and create a tsunami. And if it does that, there won't be time for people in those communities to get to higher ground. There isn't a possibility to build shelters that can protect them if that occurs. And so the scientists recommend that these people should relocate. And they engage with the local communities and they provide this information to them. And the community members understand. But they live in such an extraordinary place, and it supports their totally unique way of life. And so despite the risk, knowing about the risk, their preference is often to stay. If these two cases about values seem a little far from our everyday experience, let me try and bring it home a little bit. One of the things that you value might be your independence, your freedom to make your own choices and make your own mistakes. That doesn't make you reckless. That doesn't make you a hopelessly irrational decision maker in the face of uncertainty. Those are things you value, and they deserve to be brought to the table. So let me round up. Perhaps 3 thoughts that we can take away to our risk conversations tonight and in coming weeks and months. Number 1, spot the faulty reasoning. Watch out for that hindsight bias that tells you that it wasn't just chance. And also, don't fall into that trap yourselves. If you say to your parents, that incredibly dangerous thing that you told me not to do, well, I did it twice last week and nothing bad happened. So it can't be quite as dangerous as you said. That's hindsight bias, and your parents are going to call you on it. Second, be a savvy consumer of risk information. You face this kaleidoscope too. You're being bombarded on traditional and social media and by signs and ads about all the things that you should worry about. Remember, as you read those things, to look for the population. Is it the population that's relevant to me? Understand the risk metric that's being thrown at you. If it says the risk has doubled, check what the risk was to begin with, because a tiny risk times 2 is still a tiny risk and may not be worth you worrying about. And finally, don't be like these two. Don't have risk conversations in which you shout or you refuse to listen. We tend to think that we know the answer already before we begin. And by really listening and really seeking to understand what our interlocutor feels, thinks, and values, we can assure ourselves of a much better conversation about risk. And so with that, I wish you many productive conversations about risk, and thank you very much.